96.1 FM. All right. So what is it to whisper? What is it to speak softly to another? Is it to convey a secret? Is it to disguise something sinful? Is it to say something in the open, but only for your intended to hear? It's all those things and more. My mother whispered when she wanted to calm someone down. The louder they got, the softer she spoke. Why? So the other person would have to quiet themselves to listen, to hear. Whispering can build focus. Laughter can break defenses, and screaming can put them up. These are all ways we use emotion to direct a conversation. We've been doing it all our lives. We've been doing it with only a bare understanding of how to control it. Marketing agencies the world over have made a tidy living off of the fractional amount that we understand about the ability to read and affect the emotional state of others. So how do non-believers employ these tools, these ancient and effective means of using emotion as a wedge to pry open barriers? To begin with, there are some things to keep in mind. First up, setting the field by establishing rules and goals in your conversation. Build a kit. Build up your skills. And appealing to the emotional state of your opponent in a conversation. Approach this one with caution. The aim of argument or of discussion should not be victory, but progress. Joseph Joubert, 18th century French writer, philosopher, a contemporary of Voltaire, he said that, and he was right. So when you're setting the stage, establishing rules can be very, very powerful, not only for yourself, but for others. Try setting rules or boundaries for a conversation and then follow them yourself. Make no claims without evidence, resource, or other support. The reason you're doing these things is so that you can enforce those rules upon others in the conversation because you have been following them all along. Keep broad statements to a minimum to avoid generalizations unless you can back them up, and stay humble in your presentation. Do not claim to be all-knowing. Show it. Don't say it. Now, another very powerful tool in this arsenal is the put up or shut up commandment. Get the other person in the conversation to put their ideologies up for review. Simply say, if you're not willing to put your ideas up for criticism and possible change, then why should I? It becomes a question of reciprocity. Don't play tennis without the net. Follow the rules and hold your opponents to those same rules, stressing fairness. Another thing to remember, small moves, small steps. Make the goals in your conversation achievable. Smaller steps to a larger point. Use standalone examples that can then be built upon to attain your next goal in the conversation. And remember, you will not convince people in the moment. That's just not going to happen. These are concepts that must unspool in the mind. That takes time, much longer than a single conversation will allow. Know when to bow out gracefully. Know when to end a conversation, how to bow out gracefully, like in a design presentation. My job, my 9 to 5, is as a graphic designer that presents packages to clients. I put together these large, complex marketing concepts and then I present them to a series of clients. And almost every single design presentation I've given follows a predictable pattern. You start off the conversation and you show them the artwork and they're thrilled. They love it. The feeling in the conversation reaches a high plateau. You reach a point where everybody is astounded, is happy, is joyful at the fact that they've got this beautiful artwork that connects to their business. That high point is the highest you will ever get in the conversation. That initial moment of shock and joy is the best you can expect. Just accept that. After that high point, they start asking questions, and the expectation starts to sink. The response starts to wane. The questions start to meld in the mind and make doubt the more predominant factor that you're working with. And that appreciation level goes down to below the yes or no line, down to where they're going to say no to your project, no to your design. Then it's your job to build it back up again and get it up to, again, the highest point you're going to get. Once you get to that point, stop. Stop the conversation, change the topic, move on. Know when to end. Because any story, any explanation must have an end. So allow it to end. Now, if others in the conversation linger on a topic after you have concluded, push them to address the point that you've made or concede your point before allowing the discussion to go off on a tangent. And do not wander into parts of the conversation you are not prepared to discuss. Know when not to fight. If your goal is to use insult humor, be good at it. All right? There's a reason why professional comedians are called upon to roast each other. They give jokes, they take jokes, they're practiced at it. This is what they do. So if you're going to jump into that arena, come up with some sharp barbs. Something biting that cannot easily be turned back upon you. Be memorable and funny. That's the point. You want people to laugh, to break down that emotional barrier, and you want them to remember what you're saying. This isn't something that you can do right off the cuff. This takes practice. And insult with intent, with direction, with a greater purpose than just belittling your opponent. Insult with a point that drives your message home. Give everybody a reason to listen to you. Not just because you're funny and entertaining, because you're making a point while you're doing it. My coaches have done a good job of tightening my skills, where I can dictate a little bit more where the fight is going. Robbie Lawler is a UFC welterweight champion. Very effective at guiding the match, because the skills that he has built were built for that purpose. When you're building your kit, that's a mixed martial art expression that's starting to kind of bleed around the edges to other avenues of thought. When you're building your kit, you're building up your skills. When someone walks into a gym, they ask, what's your kit? What do you practice? Are you into wrestling? Are you into kickboxing? These are maneuvers that you practice so that when you get in the ring, you know what you're going to do. Well, when you get into a discussion, especially with theists, you want to know what you're going to do. So build up your kit. Build up a selection of skills that you can bring with you. Make examples that you use seem ridiculously reasoned and obvious, yet easily defended. I come up to the example of two men gardening. And this is where I'm going to use a small point to build upon for later points. I'm planting a seed in the conversation. Imagine you're walking down the street. There's a person walking towards you, coming towards you on the sidewalk, and over to your side there you see two men gardening. They're planting vegetables of different types next to each other. They're wearing two different types of linen and wool. They're working on the Sabbath. And they're obviously in a committed relationship with each other. Public displays of affection and everything. The person walking towards you, seeing this, picks up a stone and starts bludgeoning them bloody. Starts beating them bloody. Starts making a scene. So what do? You run in. You tackle the person to the ground. You hold them down. You call the police. Who's the more moral person in that situation? See, the men who were gardening were violating Levitican law. They were violating Exodus. They were violating Deuteronomy. These are aspects of the Old Testament. They were used to enforce morality, and every one of those aspects have come with the punishment of being bludgeoned to death with a rock. Is the person who carried out that sentence the moral person in this story, or the person who tackled that person to the ground? You can build upon a story like that, and you can make it obvious, ridiculously obvious to anybody listening, because we all live in a society where bludgeoning another person with a rock is not the way you handle a conflict of ideology. Build an inventory of responses to common questions. And I'm not just talking about questions that are common to the example you provide, but common questions just in general. Become familiar with logical fallacies for making thoughtful challenges, but avoid the tattletale voice. He did an ad hominem attack on me. He built a straw man. He's throwing a red herring. Nobody responds to these things. But if you use your knowledge of the fallacy to respond in a way that calls somebody on what they're doing, it becomes far more substantial because it's based in logic. But it's far more acceptable because it's delivered with emotion. Turn a phrase. Use clever, thought-out language in your arguments to make them more memorable. I just did this for all of you. In the story of two men gardening, I would be willing to bet that the most pronounced statement of that story that all of you remember is bludgeoned by a rock. Why? Because I used a rhetorical device that repeated the phrase, or at least the beginning of the phrase, he bludgeoned them with a rock, over and over again, piercing it into your mind, leaving an indelible mark. Days from now, you might even remember it because of the rhetorical device that I used to deliver it. Now, where do I get these stories? Where do I get these ideas? Well, I find examples in everything about the atheist community. From ancient writings of Hypatia of Alexandria, to Christopher Hitchens, to Sam Harris, The Atheist Experience with Matt Dillahunty out of Austin, all the shows they do out of Austin. Heaven forbid you even listen to my show, Talk Like an Atheist, and get some good ideas. These are all places, these are all resources with people saying the exact same thing or something very similar to what you would like to say. Use it. Find them, make them part of your kit. Also, and this is very important, make the effort. Read the Bible and the Quran, or at least enough of it to intelligently discuss them. Understand the underpinnings of the world's faith so you are able to call foul when someone defines their faith in a conversation. I can't tell you how many times I've had to tell Buddhists that yes, there's a supernatural element to reincarnation. We don't have the scientific explanation for that, so yeah, it is supernatural. Call people on their own descriptions of their faith, or at least have them correct you in a way that then leads them down a road they weren't prepared to defend. Listen to the arguments against before you encounter them in a conversation. This is another place where listening to debates, watching things on YouTube, become very, very helpful. Because then you can hear what the experts, what the most qualified members of the theist community have to offer in the way of a response to what you're saying. It gives you time to understand it and to come up with rebuttals to it so that you're not caught unawares in the moment. And be prepared to give some form of response to as many talking points as you can. Know what to say before you even go into the situation. Make the effort to be prepared. Now, there are a lot of different subgroups to the non-belief category. Agnostic, atheist, humanist, secularist. All of these have a core operating ideology that they reject the acceptance of the idea of a God. So, know how to defend atheism. Know how to defend that rejection. First off, live, work, and be an out atheist. Do not let people know who know you and who you know. Do not let them define atheists without having you as an example. If someone wants to say, oh, atheists are devil worshippers, but their brother is an atheist, that becomes functionally very difficult for them to do. Have your story ready to tell. How you became an atheist or agnostic or humanist, and why. I can't tell you how many times I've interviewed theists and they come back at me with their personal story. I was a drug user. I was Satan's handmaiden. I was a guy who went into the convenience store and got Satan his pack of cigarettes. They all have this, story of going from this negative place to this positive place, and that Christianity is the linchpin. Well, we may not have a supernatural element to add into our stories, but we do have them. So come up with yours. Define it. Practice it even. Understand the difference between atheist and agnostic, humanist and secularist. These are important distinctions that you're going to need to make to people who haven't made the effort to learn about your perspective, whom you are informing on that perspective, and know who has the burden of proof and how a negative cannot be proven. These are concepts that are ancient. They go back to the Greek city-states. They're very important in any conversation, as is being aware of your surroundings. When you are talking, are you on a one-to-one conversation, a private conversation, or an interview? You're going to use different words when you're working with a single person than you are within a group setting, amongst family and friends, in a public square, in a group conversation, giving a talk. When you're in a chat room or a social media forum, literally open to anyone dropping into the conversation, you yet again have to use even more specific language, more directed terminology, because people will go out of their way to misunderstand you. They really want to misunderstand you. It's their way of building a straw man argument online. They are desperate for it. White knuckle, grab to it. And remember, you are not just convincing your opponent. That's only one part of the situation. You are also trying to convince anybody else who is reading your exchange or listening to your conversation. So take them into account as well. Now, at this point you might be thinking this is kind of craven. I want my humanism, my agnosticism, my atheism to come naturally, to be without all of this contrivance. But when you're in a conversation with a theist, this is exactly what religious schools and institutions are doing. This is why people go together for church on Sunday. It's not for anything other than training their apologetics, reinforcing their ideology, creating a community for both inclusionary and exclusionary purposes, the effect of which is that they're keeping tribalism global in the modern world. A Bronze Age concept that it is thriving in our information age. You win battles by knowing the enemy's timing and using a timing which the enemy does not expect. Miramoto Musashi was a 15th century swordsman, probably the greatest swordsman in human history. Approach with caution. When you're appealing to your opponent's emotional state, I cannot stress enough, approach with caution. First concept of this approach that I would like to cover is what I call the Iron Man argument, or Iron Manning an argument. You're establishing your opponent's argument to get their attention and to ensure that you are representing them properly before providing the counter-argument. Now, for me, this concept, which is the opposite of the straw man argument being building up a fictitious version of your opponent's argument so you can tear it down easily, this is building up the best version of your opponent's argument so that you can represent them as accurately as possible. But this, to me, provides a bit of a conflict. See, when I was a kid, I was really into DC Comics. So my inner child is wanting to call this a Steel Man or Man of Steel argument, but now as an adult, I'm more of a Marvel fan, so I'm building an Iron Man of the argument. An example of how this can work in order to topple an opponent's ideology or their opponent's conversation is what I like to call the LSAT story. About 8 years ago, I was in Indianapolis for a technological event for the company I worked for. My boss was there, a good number of my coworkers were there, and we were meeting with different people that we do business with, one of which was this vendor. We were hanging around with him most of the day because he was walking us through all the new toys that he was selling us, and he kept referring to this problem he had with the American legal system. He was convinced that American lawyers didn't know the Constitution, that the legal schools in America did not go out of their way to teach constitutional law. And I had been listening to the story the entire day. He was very pungent about it. He was very interested in telling it as many times as he possibly could. And again, while we were at dinner, St. Elmo's Fire in Indianapolis, totally got to try it, great shrimp cocktail. He was, again, saying how he felt about this, and I asked him, where did you get the idea that this is the case? Where did you get the idea that they don't teach the Constitution in law school? And he said, well, my son-in-law just graduated law school, and at his graduation ceremony I was talking to him, and he said that he told me that they don't study constitutional law in law school. And I thought that was a little weird at first, but when I thought about it, I realized what was going on, and we had a table full of people, my boss, all my coworkers, the vendor, a couple of other vendors, everybody chomping away at their steaks, agreeing with them, yeah, down with law schools. I'm like, well, let me game this out a little bit for you. And I built an Iron Man of his conversation. I said, your perspective is that a student goes through grammar school, goes through high school, makes good grades, takes the standardized aptitude test, or the SAT, and gets into a good college. And he said, yeah, that sounds about right. When they get into that college, they have a major, say pre-law. They go through all these classes, learning, studying, developing out their knowledge set. They take their final exams, they get their bachelor's degree, and then they go and take the LSATs, a legalized standardized aptitude test. He said, yeah, that sounds about right. Then they get into a law school based off of their grades and the result of that test. They go through the law school, they learn about the living law, they get a master's degree, they take the bar exam, they pass it, they become a lawyer. That's the path you're talking about. You say, exactly. So let's rewind that a little bit. What do you think they test for on the legal standardized aptitude test that you take between your graduate level and your postgraduate law degree? Well, I hadn't thought about that. Obviously, they teach the Constitution at the bachelor level. Obviously, you have to know it in order to pass the legal standardized aptitude test. All you have to do is Iron Man the argument, and you can see that it is obvious that they don't teach something in law school that you have to know before getting into law school. This is obvious. But it wasn't obvious to anybody at that table until I walked it out bit by bit and said, this is the error. I Iron Manned his argument and then pointed to the weak point that he wasn't thinking of. And it became very effective because a couple days later, he found me at that convention and said, you know what? You changed my mind. I thought that was a problem with the legal system. Obviously, I didn't understand what was going on. Thanks. It was non-confrontational. I got his attention. I was able to do it in front of my boss and coworkers without any threat to the standing in my job or with any business relationship. You're able to have these conversations. You're able to appeal to emotion. You just got to do it the right way, and always, always approach with caution. Now, another tool that I like to use, not in the previous situation, this is a little more abrasive, is challenge the moral foundations. All right? When you're talking to a theist, they are operating under the ideology that they are on a moral high ground. That they have defined morality within this ideology that has existed for thousands of years. Challenge it. Because the morality of today is very different than it was in the Bronze and Iron Ages when these scriptures were developed. Attack the perceived strength. Challenge that idea. Challenge the religious argument on moral grounds. Take away that high ground. It destabilizes the other side of the conversation when they don't have a foundation to be able to reliably stand upon. Be prepared to define and defend your morality. your definition of morality. For me, the definition is evolved morality. For me, the idea is the human animal evolved intelligence, evolved wisdom, evolved emotional control, evolved society. Why not morality? Why not have this idea of right or wrong or what is permissible or not permissible? Why not have this moral foundation? So using that as a means of bypassing the high ground that they're operating from can get you a lot further in the conversation than trying to at first present reason and logic argument, because they're going to try to use morality as a means to object to your reason. They're going to try to use it as a reason to say, that doesn't matter, I've got this moral high ground. Another way to pierce that veil, or another way to go through that barrier, is surprise. Some people like being surprised, but most people are not a fan of it. They don't like the idea of somebody saying something that is directly contrary to what they think. And so a surprise will come as a shock. It'll come as a shock in a way that can penetrate that barrier, that can make them listen to you. For example, when you use an outlandish statement that can be turned into an obvious truth, like taxing the churches would protect children from being sexually abused. How is that? Where do you get from revenue to prevention of pedophilia? How does that happen? Another one, Christianity is remarkable in how un-American it is. Again, all these people are saying, hey, we're a Christian nation, and you are standing here saying that Christianity is un-American. How can you do that? It's a surprising statement. So let's evaluate them a little bit. First one up. Taxing the churches would protect children from being sexually assaulted. With this one, you can up the ante. You can make it an even stronger statement by saying that this would be effective even if the tax rate was 0%. Even if there were no revenues involved at all. This would be an effective tactic for combating pedophilia in organized religion. How? Because it requires the churches to file tax returns for tracking the money when they hide predators. You see, a tax return is a law enforcement instrument, as well as a revenue collection device. It gives us a chart of where the money's coming in and out, and that currently doesn't exist for religious organizations. Therefore, the money used to protect pedophiles is dark money. It doesn't exist on the books anywhere. All those donations that are given fall into a black hole from an accounting perspective. Finding the settlements that are paid out to victims so journalists can track and report these crimes, just the way that journalists track and report any other crime from any other organization. We're not asking for anything different than what already exists. We're just asking for it to be applied in a certain direction. And opening the books can give a community a clear picture of how religious donations are being used. So now you've gone from a surprising statement that has no apparent connection to something, again, that is ridiculously obvious once you give it 30 seconds of explanation. The next one I used. Christianity is remarkable in how un-American it is. How is that a possible statement? Everybody and their brother is saying that America is a Christian nation. We're a majority Christian population, 72%-ish, depending on the numbers. The only connecting tissue between the Bible and the Constitution is slavery. The only thing that we had in our Constitution that we also have in both Old and New Testaments was the tacit, if not explicit, support of slavery. And if you disagree, if you get somebody that says, no, that's not true, there's plenty of other things, show me the verse. Show me the homily that says, blessed are the voters, for the will of the people is the will of God. Right? It doesn't exist. Show me the verse that talks about a separation of powers. Show me the verse that talks about freedom of speech in the same book that says, thou shalt not take the Lord's name in vain. Show me a verse that has freedom of religion from a religion that's so exclusive as Christianity. and that has such a bloody history of annihilating other religions. And then you can just easily go through a litany of reasons why we don't want America to be a Christian nation. That isn't a good idea. Quote the Founding Fathers. Quote the Treaty of Tripoli. Quote all of these different documents and parts of our history that separate church and state for a very good reason. Now, another tool that I like to use, especially with online interactions, is to resolve the numbers. Atheists, agnostics, humanists, secularists, we're supposed to be, science and math geeks, right? We're supposed to understand these concepts, so use them. Resolve percentages into whole numbers for a greater effect. Let me give you an example. But first, use solid numbers. Again, use facts. Use things you can back up. Use some stats with pedigree and impeccable science, something you can put your back against in a conversation. One such source that I rely upon is the Pew Forum. Pew Research is one of the most dynamic, popular opinion companies on the planet, and they do excellent work. About 7 years ago, the Pew Forum released a report about attitudes towards Islam in the Islamic communities around the world. They went through 40 countries, interviewed over 38,000 people to glean a representative sample of all these different places so they could get an idea of what the attitudes were of the people who were calling themselves Muslim. They wanted to get a better definition of it. One of the countries they chose was Indonesia. Indonesia has the largest population of Muslims on the planet, by far. 204 million Indonesians are Muslim. And 72% of them said that they support Sharia. Sharia is a legal code developed off of the Quran and the Hadith that has been unchanged since the 10th century. It has been fundamentally unchanged for over a millennia. And still, 72% of Muslims in this one country support it. Now let's break that down into a whole number. In whole numbers, that's 147,489,000 people. It's a little bit more of a real number once you see it next to that percentage. But even more real, that represents just under 50% of the American population. In the one country of Indonesia, just under 50% of the American group of people, roughly the same size as half of the American population, support a legal system that is unchanged since the Iron Age. All right? Not saying that's a good thing, not saying that's a bad thing. That is a thing. All right? But let's take a closer look at the study within regard to this one country. And you can look at the other 39 countries very easily. I invite you to go view the Pew Forum report, compare it with the Pew Research Council's population numbers for these countries, and do these mathematics yourself. It's not difficult. I've got a spreadsheet if you want it. I'll hand it to you. 147 million. By the way, that is greater than the population of Russia. How many decades have we been at odds with a group of people with a political ideology that was against liberal democracy? In Indonesia, that's a pretty large group, and we're not worried about Indonesians. Of those Indonesians that supported Sharia, the next question was, how many support Hunan punishment? Hunan punishment is the practice of cutting off a hand when you steal a loaf of bread, cutting off your nose if you lie, cutting off a leg, cutting off genitals. 45% of that group support it. 48% support stoning adulterers. Do not, for a fraction of a second, let it pass through your mind that they mean men. Men are not stoned to death for cheating on their wives. Wives are stoned to death for cheating on their husbands. Talk about a Me Too moment. All right? 18% support the death penalty for apostates. That's us. Everybody in this room. all right? But saying that of the Indonesian population, 97% of which are Muslim, and 72% of which support Sharia, 18% support capital punishment for apostasy. When you break down all those percentages to somebody who's not aware of those population numbers, that's a small number. That's an insignificant number. That's something that can be easily dismissed and ignored because they're seeing it in the wrong perspective. Let's look at those as whole numbers. 66,370,000 people by this representative sample support Hunan punishment in that one country. The country of the United Kingdom, the four nations that create the United Kingdom, that's 66 million people. More people in one country support Hunan punishment than the entirety of the United Kingdom. 70,750,000 support stoning adulterers. That's greater than the population of Thailand. This last one is the important one, though. 26,548,000 Indonesians support the death penalty for apostasy. The state of Texas has 28 million. I know it's not difficult to come to this imagined reality, but imagine for a moment that the state of Texas became so fanatical that all of the Christians there decided that if you leave Christianity, you should be put to death. Imagine how different our politics in this country would be if that was the situation. Yet that's the number that's being ignored. Which list has the greater emotional impact? Which list makes you remember it more? Resolve the numbers. It's a great way to work towards framing the conversation. When you frame the conversation, you want to frame it, the customs of religious culture, in terms of slavery, because every religion out there, at one point or another, except for maybe Jainism, supported slavery. Imprisonment, how a culture can be a prison for those who are in it. The women who were married off as children in Indonesia, who will get stoned to death if they go someplace else for companionship, let's say, they're in a prison. They don't get to go out. They don't get to be who they want to be. Victimization of vulnerable members in society. I know that the idea of these religious organizations is to support the vulnerable members of society, the orphanages, the leper colonies. We have history filled with it, but we also have a diverse and horrifying history of marginalization of people who are in vulnerable positions in our society, whether they be children, whether they be women, whether they be the infirm. How domestic abuse is justified in the church. How many times have we seen this? How many times have we heard this? How many times do we have to hear this before we say something? Child abuse, how it's disguised and hidden. Sexual assault and rape. These are in the scriptures. You can go through the Old Testament and pull them out fairly quickly. And most importantly, how shame culture is used in these situations. Aren't you ashamed? You were born with original sin. You need to go pray for forgiveness. You need to go ask to be accepted by this religious leader or not. The shame is a useful tool in control, but it's a terrible byproduct of making these communities vulnerable to predators that seek to use that shame as a cloak to hide behind. Frame the conversation. This is why I fight. This is why I do what I do. This is the sole purpose behind my radio show, behind these talks, is to fight this, because this hurts me as a human. I don't have to be a Christian to have empathy for the children of Christian families who are denied medical care in exchange for prayer. I don't have to be Muslim to feel for the women and the children who are brought up in a society where they're not allowed to learn about science and technology, where they're not allowed to accept evolution, where they're not allowed to understand what Big Bang cosmology is and means. These are all things that as a human, I am very much interested in. As an American, having Christian values imposed in politics, these are the things that drive me. So, when you are building your kit, when you are approaching the emotional side of the conversations, be able to answer for yourself why you're doing it. I love questions. They can be both challenge and reward in a single breath. And I invite your questions. Please. Thank you very much.
Okay, I will go around, try to get in a reasonable order questions that, no, I'm going to do it today. I have to instruct you more. We're going to invite questions, but you have to have the mic in your hand, and I will walk the mic around. Remember, hold it very close to your mouth, otherwise I have to turn the gain up too high and it starts to squeal. Shoot.
No. Okay.
Thank you. My name's Roy Elder.
Hello.
And most of the people are familiar with my background. I have a master's degree in cybernetic systems, and cybernetic systems employs feedback control. That's the nature of that. So back in '85 when I got my master's degree, I used all of the tools that you had.
Nice. Terrific. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, this first of all, fantastic talk.
Thank you very
really
much.
Really good. When I'm arguing with people that are politically or religiously at odds with me, it seems like the first thing that comes to my mind is to gain their confidence. People want to feel that you're not attacking them.
Right.
So if you can find a common ground with them in some way, then they relax, and then they really will listen to what you have to say. I really think that that's the first thing that you want to establish is a rapport with the individual.
I find that, yes, that tool of diplomacy is extremely effective in situations where somebody is already primed to listen. When someone wants to listen, when someone wants to communicate, when they're willing to put their ideas on the table, finding that commonality is something that can happen. It's possible. When someone is not willing to put their ideas on the table, that's the barrier. And getting through with that diplomatic tool sometimes requires a wedge to open the barrier to actually land that. Because I could say something along the lines of, we are both X, Y, and Z. And the next thing the other person says to me, and this has happened more often than I can count, is that they will say, no, that's what's different about us. Or, no, what's different about us is that they use that as a launching pad for what they disagree with you on. So, going into a situation that gives them a means to push back in the other direction, from a tactical standpoint, it may not always work. It depends on the person you're talking to. What does work with most people is surprise. I love using surprise. Surprise is fun. Because then what you're doing is you're putting them in a position where they're taking their preconceived notions and turning it into how they can defend their side of the argument. It's a tricky thing. There's no right answer to it, but it really does depend on who you're talking to, whether you can actually use that diplomatic tool to begin with, or if you're just going to hit a barrier straight off. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'd love to talk, and I agree that framing the talk up front, framing the discussion is really critically important.
Yes.
I want to make a comment and then I'm going to ask a question. The first comment is, when you compared the American government to atheism or Christianity, you used the term separation of church and state.
Yes.
And I've always found it to be far more effective to say separation of religion and government. Because if you talk to a conservative person, even a Christian, and you say, do you want to keep government out of religion? Do you want to keep religion out of government? they almost always agree to that. But if you say church and state, they're thinking, well, I like churches in my state. I'm not against that.
Yeah, okay, I can see where being a little more literal on that could be helpful. Sure.
So I find that to be real good. Now, my challenge to you, and I don't know if you can answer this question, is how do you frame the debate around the abortion debate? Because it seems really difficult for me.
It's difficult, it's prescient, and there are usually, there's a couple of things that I do with abortion. And again, approach with caution, because you are touching a rare nerve. This is a third rail in no small way. But there's two things I like to bring up. First off, define for me when life begins, because that is an essential part of the question. Now, it's open to debate. For me, the viability argument is the gold standard. Once the fetus can live, is viable outside the womb of the mother, then it's an independent life. So there you've got a demarcation line to go with. But it doesn't matter where your demarcation line really is. I have a scientist friend who is vociferously pro-choice. But she defines life as beginning at conception, because that's when a distinctive genetic signature is created, and that distinctive genetic could be just as easily the means by which you define life as anything else. However, for her, the argument goes by way of consent. Are we willing to take consent away from a mother to have her body used by another person that she didn't invite in, or that she doesn't want there anymore, or that was accidentally put there? So that's one way of going about it. The other way, especially if you're working with theism, is that most Judeo-Christians don't really understand the perspective of their own texts. In Genesis, when God creates man, he clumps together mud, or a clot of blood if you're into the Torah, and then breathes life. So does that mean that life begins at the breath? Seems to be. But let's go a step further. How many of you heard eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth? Right? That's an age-old statement, right? If you read the story in Exodus where that line comes from, you actually get a pro-life statement out of it, in a way. See, the situation is that when two men are fighting, and one of the men's pregnant wife intervenes to try to break up the fight, and the person, not her husband, accidentally punches her. I mean, really specific. I don't know where they got this, but this is what it is. Punches her in the stomach. If the child, the unborn child, if the fetus dies, then that man who punched her has to pay the husband a penalty. He has to pay them money. If the wife dies, if the woman dies, then the person who punched her dies. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. So there is an obvious distinction being made between the value of an unborn child, worth money, and the value of the mother, life for a life. So you can break a theist's concept of when life begins and the perspective of their own faith by simply Iron Manning the argument for them, by simply giving them what they claim they believe to begin with. Next up.
Hi, thank you for the great talk. I appreciate it. I'm just concerned about our politics in America, and not just in America, but across the world.
Sure.
How we're divided, and how there are truths that some people are buying and others aren't. And it's this conflict, and not just us. There's England, they do the same thing, they fight like hell.
Yeah,
and
I'm watching Brexit with bated breath here. I'm trying to see what they're going to be doing with that.
Yeah. So I just wonder how we're struggling to get along, apparently across the whole globe. Correct?
I would say that we are more aware of the struggle now than we have ever been. This explosion of technology we are currently enjoying, I mean, even in this room right now, microphones, computers, cameras, the whole nine yards. This explosion of technology is giving us the ability to communicate with each other in far more intrinsic ways. We hear about something that 20 years ago wouldn't have even come up on our radar. So how much of it is actually a problem, and how much of it is just a realization of a status quo we never knew we were living in to begin with? So that's one point that I make towards that. The second point is that when we have a situation where there is a separation between what is perceived as reality and what is actually reality, the question of how we arrive at the truth becomes absolutely fundamental and incredibly important. So stress honesty, stress evidence, stress logic and reason. Do it with an emotional appeal, break down those barriers as you can, but try to get to how people come to their definition of truth so that at least you have a starting point that makes sense. Yes, sir.
Okay, so the other day,
Yes.
I was watching Joe Rogan's interview of Alex Jones.
I haven't seen this one yet, but I have heard that he had done that, yes.
Yeah, it was very, let's say, interesting. But one thing I really noticed is Alex Jones, like, will go off on some crazy topic
Yeah.
for a period of time. I mean, Joe Rogan really doesn't challenge him on anything because that's not really his style. But it seems like even if he does a little bit, and even when Joe challenges him, he kind of dismisses him and then just goes off on some other crazy tangent.
Right.
And just keeps going. Like, what do you do about that? Like, what?
All right, so what Alex Jones is doing is a combination of a very compartmentalized version of fanaticism and talking past whoever he's talking to. He has a plan for what he's going to say before he gets there, and come hell or high water, he is going to say what he has come to say, whether you ask him a question in that subject matter or not. That is his way of controlling a situation. Now, to break down that type of control, you have to become fanatical in keeping them on point. You have to keep hammering them back and forth. And after the first, the second, the third, the fourth time, he just goes off into a different direction. Start using stronger language. The more they push away, the more you can characterize it as cowardice. The more you can characterize it as a means of disguising deliberate ignorance. It's not that you don't know this, you don't want to know this. It's not that you're that gullible, it's that you want to be that gullible. That's the response that I give to that, because if someone isn't willing to address the point that I'm making, then they've lost, whether they realize it or not.
Okay, so I'm going to extend it for till 20 after. We normally stop at 12:15, so that maybe there'll be time for one or two more questions.
Please do.
Oh, thanks. I found it interesting. You commented on those theists that go to church and reinforce their tribalism and stuff on whenever they do it, or Saturday for the Jewish faith or whatever.
Sure.
How is that any different than what's going on right here, right now?
That was kind of my point. What we're doing right here is creating community. We're talking to each other. We're reinforcing each other's ideologies. But, and this is the but that creates the vast world of difference, the Grand Canyon between the two sides. One side has based the entirety of their discussion, from the morality to the history to the science, on Scripture, on a construct that was developed when people didn't know where the sun went at night. When people thought spitting on a wound was proper care. Versus people like us that take in all of this information and allow it to change our perspective. Allow it to make us grow and develop as people. If you are willing to say that God did it, and accept that as an explanation, you have stopped looking for an explanation. It's like a child. When you tell them to do something, go, I know. Isn't that the most annoying thing on the planet? Right? Or one of? They don't know. It's obvious they don't know. You have to explain it to them. But if they think they know, if they think they have the answer, they're not going to listen. So in response to that concept of, aren't we doing the same thing? I could come up here and show you numbers about the attitudes of Islam in Indonesia that completely change your perspective simply by comparing the percentages to whole numbers. I'm not relying upon supernatural. I'm not relying upon revealed or reverent knowledge. Cold hard fact, right there on the screen. There's your difference.
Yeah,
This will be the last question.
okay. I just want to comment. I found most of the time, if I'm debating, or debating is a strong word, if I'm discussing religion or different beliefs with someone, I usually end up stopping the conversation because it's gotten ridiculous. You know, someone was telling me about the flood, and I said, he said it covered the whole earth. I said, where'd all the water go? He says, well, there were probably fewer mountains back then. And I said, no, you're just making up things to support your argument.
My favorite response on the Noah thing, by the way, is how do freshwater fish exist? If the entire world was covered with water, it's all salt water. How do freshwater fish exist? It's magic, right? So once you accept a claim of supernatural basis, you've already lost the conversation. You have to challenge it. And it involves either interrupting somebody mid-sentence, which is usually considered rude, or taking notes in a conversation so you can catch all the fallacies as they go down, or you remember the highlights and say, you know, you said a lot of stuff there that I think is total and complete BS, but here are the few things I remembered, and these are the reasons why they were. And you just knock them down. You swat them down like flies. And you just keep knocking them down and knocking them down because they have the burden of proof. You don't. That's the point that really sticks in conversations. When someone says that there was a global flood that wiped out all humanity, and you point out that that it could not have happened, that there is everything from geological sciences to physical sciences, astronomical sciences, just good sense that says that couldn't have happened, you are knocking down their attempt to prove their supernatural explanation. And that's really the best way to go about doing that. Because if not, once you accept a supernatural explanation, even, you know, I'll take that, you know, just saying, you open yourself up in a very real way. And it's something I warn against whenever I'm talking to people about this topic.
Okay, so that is going to wrap it up. Why don't we give our speaker a hand, please?